Well, it's no JCS, but I think it'll do. Jesus Christ the Exorcist by Neal Morse. So Neal Morse really doesn't need too much of an introduction at this point, especially if you're in the prog sphere. He was one of the founding members of Spock's Beard, and then in the late 90s, early 2000s, he departed from the band to really focus in on his spirituality and his religious writings. And this is now, what, the 25th studio album? Because the guy is non-stop, and this doesn't even include any of the side projects that he's been involved with. So most of the albums that he's been writing up to this point have some kind of a religious hint on it. Now, within recent years, he has kind of deviated a little bit from that, especially with the advent of the Neal Morse Band in 2015. And I've actually been listening to this quite a lot. Like, this is probably my third or fourth week with the project. And one thing right off the get-go is that I've never been bored. Even though I've had so much time with this album, I've never felt bored with it. I think the overall presentation of this album is really, really well done and really well crafted. It feels much more poppy in approach, a lot more accessible. Even though it still has that progressive rock banner on it, there's not a whole lot of tracks that can really be labeled as a prog piece. A lot of these tracks are within the radio-friendly timeline of 2 to about 5 minutes in length. I think the oddball tracks, the first one is Jesus' Temptation, and the second one is The Madman in the Garden, at least on disc 1. And on disc 2, we have Jesus, Gethsemane. I can never pronounce half of these. It's the fifth track, and then Jesus Before Pilate and the Crucifixion. Obviously, my favorite tracks are these tracks. It's the ones that are a bit longer, they're a bit bigger in scope, they have a lot more proggy elements, and they all follow Neal Morse's signature. Like, this was one thing throughout Neal Morse's discography, is that he's found himself a box. Like, he's found himself a formula to play in, and he's never really deviated from that formula. Like, there's nothing breathtakingly new on this album. A lot of these do feel like they are jam sessions that we found on previous albums. Like, when you listen to it, you immediately think, yep, this is another Neal Morse album. So if you're into that kind of thing, you're gonna love this. The one thing, as I was mentioning before, is his use of harmonizations on this one. It feels a lot more of his poppy styles, like something you would hear out of Flying Colors. There's a lot of moments that harken back to, say, a Beatles era. And another thing about this album that is both good and bad is the singing talent that we have on this album, because we have quite a number of guest musicians on here. The one thing that I will say, though, is that they all lend themselves to the same kind of prog rock singing styles, and so it's really kind of hard to like differentiate who's singing what part. And you kind of have to look at the liner notes or know the story to know who's singing at what time. And I do wish that there was a little bit more of, I guess, a variety of singer styles. Like maybe somebody who's a little bit more operatic, somebody who's a little bit more grungy, somebody that's a little bit more like guttural, just to differentiate who's singing at one time, right? Because in all honesty, like, as much as I love Ted Leonard, who's singing Jesus, as well as Nick DeVarlo who's playing Judas, and both of these individuals have actually played with Neal or Neal's projects before. I think Nick is one of the lead singers for Spock's Beard at the moment, and Matt Smith being John the Baptist, and Jake Livegreen as Peter. Again, they all have that same style of singing, but their singing is still fantastic, and it is still brilliant, so I can't really discredit what we have on the album. It will be very easy to go over the top with a lot of these lyrics, especially with the subject matter that we have on file here, but they're able to keep it humble to a point when the story needs them to be, because at this point it's less of a song and more of a role. So talking about the overall album song by song would be ridiculous, because we've got as I said, 2 discs, and along those 2 discs we have 25 tracks, so that's a lot of tracks to go by. So I'm not going to be doing that. I'm just going to be bringing out some highlights, some things that I really, really enjoyed. As I already mentioned, my favorite track off of this album is probably Jesus' Temptation, coming in at 10 minutes and 20 seconds. Love where this song goes. I love how it introduces a lot of the themes that we'll be hearing throughout the album. And I love how they have that battle. Like, it does emphasize the evil and the devil's theme within that, where we're hearing that lies, lies, everyone lies like them do, 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 do. And I do like how it does blend into the, the revelation. And that's probably my favorite little suite. It's very catchy, it's very poppy. I find myself singing along and humming along to it, or is that do 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 do. Like, that is really fun, and I wish that they used that a little bit more throughout the runtime of the album, because the devil's theme is found throughout the album and a number of times. I also like the Madman of the Gardens and how punchy this track is. This is one of the few tracks that actually features Neal Morse in the vocal reign, where he's kind of taking over the Legion, right? Where it's like a lot of these demons are inhabiting this man's body, and it's just driving him insane. And so Jesus comes and he removes it, exorcises it, and puts it into a flock of pigs, and then the pigs essentially run off a cliff. Fun times, fun times. Within Legion, we have a lot of those voices, and this is something that Neal Morse is really good at, is constructing these choruses of voices, these rounds of singing styles. And I mean, it also has something that I hadn't really heard too much. Like, we have heard this kind of style, but this more of like a rockin', like a straight up rock aspect. And we have that within the Mary Magdalene character when she's first introduced after the Jesus' temptation, and there's a highway of the woman of seven devils, and that's kind of Mary's introduction of her profession. Her character progresses really quickly because we've got the woman and then Free at Last. Like, the two songs create like a 10-minute suite of the introduction and kind of like Mary's realization that, oh shoot, this guy's the real deal here. But I do want to talk a little bit about the actual story and the actual construction of this album, because the music, as I said, kind of talks for itself on this. I don't really have to go too much in depth about that. All I really need to say is it's more of Neal Morse's writing, but I do want to talk a little bit about the structure of the album, as well as kind of the story and what Neal decided to include and what he decided to leave out, because it is essentially the testament of the Christ. It is the New Testament. It's a conglomeration of Matthew, Mark, Luke, and John, and also the structure about this. Like, it was structured pretty well, and the first disc is kind of Jesus's miracles, and the second disc is all the passion. The second disc opens up with He Must Go to the Cross, which is basically the council saying, yeah, this Jesus guy is causing a ruckus and we need to get him out. But I do like how the first disc ends with the keys to the kingdom, because it does create a very good crescendo moment for the first disc. It closes the first act off very, very well. But then we have Get Behind Me, Satan, which is one of the singles off the album. And even though it is Christ saying, okay, I'm going to do this, I'm in it to win it, and I'm going to push Satan aside, like, I'm fully committed here. It's a very interesting track to end the first album on, because it's one of the most rockin' tracks off the album. It's one of the most driven tracks off the album. And it follows up a song that is a clear closer. So it was very interesting to see where that where it fell within the track lengths. And He Must Go to the Cross is a great way to open up the second disc, because the first disc obviously opens up with a grand entrance. We have, the overtures. There's a couple of moments on this where I was just like, that's interesting. It's on Jesus Before the Council and Peter's Denial, the sixth track off of the second disc here. That's where Jesus is essentially being, interrogated, making sure that, he's going to die. Drawing comparisons to Jesus Christ Superstar is really, really hard for me. And the whole time I'm listening to this, I had to like really consciously push that to the back of my head and not think about it. But throughout the runtime of Jesus Christ Superstar, whenever anybody challenges Christ on, are you really the Son of God? Are you really the Messiah? And throughout the entire runtime, he's very humble about it. He's very, well, that's what you say, and never really given a definitive answer. Within the sixth track of the second disc of Jesus Before the Council and Peter's Denial, they're asking, are you really the Son of God? And he just like owns it. He's just like, I am, and I will stand before you anointed, or something along those lines. Like, I know that's not the actual lyrics, but like how he comes in, he's just like, yes, I am. And we're just like, whoa, dude, that's like, we're all here for owning your truth here, but holy jeez, that's Okay. Yeah, we no longer have that humbled Christ that we have on JCS. We definitely have like the self-assured, the self-actualized Christ of, yep, we're in it to win it. We're going to do this. And that was interesting. That was very interesting. Again, what they decide to leave on here and what they decide to take off. Like the first disc, as I said, is more of the miracles. And I do wish with a title of the work of Jesus Christ the Exorcist, we would have gotten a little bit more of his miracles, like rising Lazarus, or walking on water, or turning water into wine, or, you know, spending more time really getting into Christ the figure and some of the miracles that he did, instead of just talking about the first disc, which kind of cherry picks whichever ones we have, and then ending it off like with the Passion. And I can understand why they ended it with the Passion. It's very easy to write. It's very like, you know, greatest story ever told kind of a thing. But I do wish that we had more suites where he's performing those miracles and kind of coming into the Christ figure that we know today. And I think it would have been really cool if they ended it with the Last Supper, because at that point we can then go straight into JCS, and I think the two would have played very, very well together. And I will admit, the thing that I really, really appreciate, and the thing that I really do love about what he's included, was the after effect, was actually the rising of Christ after the 3 days, because that's Mary at the Tomb, the last 3 tracks. And Mary at the Tomb might be my third favorite track after the Madman and Jesus' Temptation, because Mary's interplay with Jesus is just heart-wrenching, where she's weeping that they've moved the body, that the stone has been rolled away, and her line of, "Where have they moved my dear Jesus?" And then Jesus comes in and she's just like, "Why do you weep? Who is your Lord?" And there's, you know, that's one of my favorite parts of actually the New Testament, is where Mary's kind of at a loss, and then Jesus kind of steps forward and he's just like, "I'm always here." Like, that metaphor is just brilliant. Like, even after somebody's dead and gone, they're still with you. But just how they're able to put that onto music, where Jesus, throughout the whole runtime, as I've already mentioned, is very like self-actualized. He's very like, yes, I'm forefront, I am present, I'm her. And this is him at the most intimate, where all he has to say is, "Mary." And like at that point, my heart's just like gripped, like, right? Like, oh, that just, I could just feel a hand on my heart just go, and I'm like, and like she turns around, and so that her response of "Rabbi," even though it's probably one of the most intimate tracks off the album, it's probably like the hardest track off the album. And then we go into the big celebration of the greatest love of all time, and He has called my name, which is the big yay, religion, hurrah. And so I mean, if you're into that, you're just going to be completely on board and completely swept away. But yeah, I can see a lot of my fan base who aren't religious being like, "Well, that was a waste of like 2 hours," which yeah, it would have been. But yeah, I mean, if you're into that, and you know, you're going to definitely be moved by the end of it. And I find myself getting pretty emotional by the end as well. That's about it. I mean, this album is definitely a beast, and I'll come right out and say that this was leagues ahead of The Great Adventure. Like, The Great Adventure for me was fine, but this one is a lot more accessible. It's taking a little bit of a step forward in terms of Neal's musical presentation. It doesn't feel like a carbon copy of anything else, even though it does follow the formula of Neal very, very closely, if I'm being perfectly honest. But I found myself returning to this album time and time again and never getting bored within the long runtime that we have. So this was a fantastic album, and one that I am not at all saddened that I had to physically buy, because, I mean, Neal doesn't allow any of his music to be streamed unless it's under his Waterfall app, and I'm too cheap to do that. So yeah, I shelled out the money for it, and I'm actually very excited about it, because that's the rating for this. I would definitely buy this in physical format, because I did, and it's a good time. I highly recommend it. If you're a fan of Neal Morse, if you're a fan of Spock's Beard, if you're a fan of that retro prog and you don't mind having such a hard religious leaning on an album, then you're going to find something on this album that's really going to connect with you. So yeah, that's about it. What did you guys think of Jesus Christ the Exorcist by Neal Morse? Did you love it? Did you hate it? Let me know of your own thoughts by commenting down below. Thank you guys so much for watching. As always, you guys are definitely the best. And until next time, Up's out.